Hello, this is Rahul from Wayne State University back, and we're going to be talking about our fourth webinar in our series on research training and professional development, how to organize a really great literature review. So let me share my screen and then we will get started. So there is the caveat though that this is for a qualitative paper because that is my wheelhouse, and sometimes you'll find that there's quite a different logic sometimes when it comes to organizing literature review for a qualitative paper versus a quantitative paper. So um, basically, the question comes down to this simple one. You've read reams of journal articles and book chapters. How do you organize it all for a great, not just good, but great literature or theory review section in your paper? Um, And that's why this section is actually pretty much filmed right after I finished doing webinar 3, which was about finding the relevant sources to include in a literature review for a qualitative paper. And in that webinar, I really highlighted the amazing lessons I learned from this book by Karen Golden Biddle and Karen Locke on, it was titled Composing Qualitative Research. This book really highlights some really important goals for the literature review. And it's helpful to just quickly go over these goals again right now, because that will be helpful to understand how your literature review should be organized. So the goals for the literature review are, for number one, to articulate why your study is significant, why is it important. Number two, to situate your study in the broader literature of various disciplines. Number three, to target or problematize the contribution that your study will make. So how has the literature really addressed a particular issue, and what is the space that your study will contribute? And then number four, start foreshadowing a little bit about what exactly this contribution is going to be and how you will make this contribution to your project. So those are the four goals of a literature review. So how do you get around to accomplishing these goals? I have one major super tip, if you will. That's number one. And that is that when you are reading journal articles for your coursework, your classwork, do not just read them only for the content, the theoretical frameworks that the authors are drawing on, or maybe the findings, the really interesting findings that you have found inspirational. In addition to the content, theory, and findings, you also should read them for the structure of various sections and subsections within the articles and the logical flow, how each of these sections and subsections inevitably flow from one to the other via the aid of logical moves. Why is this important? Because it stems from the recognition that a research paper, any research paper, is really a rhetorical argument. It's an argument that you are making to support your point of view that is, of course, based on research findings, but it is nevertheless a persuasive attempt to encourage the reviewers and the reader to see things from your perspective. So the rhetorical argument aspect is really, really important. Model your paper on key exemplars. And so the exemplars, or the best practices examples, if you will, from your course readings are going to be fantastic. So what are some sorting strategies that you can employ? Another, by the way, great research article to read if you want to see some of this in journal article format would be Van de Vee and Bannister's article called How to Write a Literature Review from 2016. I've got the citation right there for you. You can use webinar number 1, how to find research citations online, to actually download the article for that citation, right? So, what are some sorting strategies? First of all, set the stage. Why is this important? So there should be some sort of a introductory paragraph at the start of your literature review to go over and introduce what are the different subsections that will follow within that large literature review section, and what do you want to really emphasize. The second strategy is narrating your argument. Remember, we talked about how a literature review, and in fact, the entire paper, is in many ways a rhetorical argument. So you need to tell a story. It's not simply enough to dump all the literature, all the scholarly citations right there, and simply say, study one talks about this, study two says about this. No. You need to use studies 1 through 50, if you've got 50 articles, to really tell a story about how the literature has situated this topic and how you are hoping to push the boundaries of the field and the literature even more with your project. Now, Van Wee and Bannister talk about at least 3 strategies of narrating, and I think these are really, really great strategies. There's first is the categorical strategy, right, where you emphasize what are the different categories of that have been covered so far in your literature that you are reviewing. The third a format or strategy of narrating is chronological. And this one goes over how the field or different fields, if you're working on an interdisciplinary project, has tended to over time address a topic. How has the treatment of the topic or the issue changed over time chronologically? And then finally, argumentative. So usually in this strategy, you are highlighting key debates in the field. How have people addressed the issue? And how have these perspectives sometimes competed for attention, maybe on the same topic? And this is really, again, great to highlight the movements and shifts within the field. So you should think about these, file away. We're going with a filing metaphor in the image right there. So you should actually file away these strategies also for when we start talking about narrating your research findings in a later webinar, because a lot of these strategies are going to come back later on. 2 other elements of the narrating aspect I'm going to focus on just a little bit later, and they're focused on the content and the arrangement. What should you include in your sorting strategy, and is there a particular order, and how should this order be defined as you sort these elements? So we'll come back to these 2 questions in a bit. But moving on, sometimes you often find in really great literature reviews that the authors have used tools like tables and graphics to also sort and make sense of the volumes of literature that they've unearthed. And this can be really helpful, especially if you're doing something like a meta theory or a meta review of the literature. It's usually optional, so you don't feel compelled to use a table or a graphic. But sometimes a graphic, especially for instance, can help understand, for instance, how maybe different movements and shifts in the field have occurred over the years. Number 4, you'll also want to include transitions from one subsection to another within your literature review. The worst thing for a reviewer is to really find the subsections just jarringly just moving from one to another without really any connection across them at all. What can you highlight as a transition? Well, this is really where webinar 3 becomes really important. So all the stuff that we talked about earlier, gaps in knowledge, why these gaps are important to fill, and how you plan on filling this gap in knowledge, that becomes really, really important and useful to plan your transition from one subsection to another. So that book by Golden, Middle, and Locke, that becomes really crucial for you right about now. And then finally, When you end the literature review section, you should be careful to always end with a summary. Because by the end of your 7-page or 8-page literature review for a qualitative research paper, which generally goes about 25 pages, by this time you've really just bombarded your reviewer and reader with a lot of, hopefully important and relevant information. But it is a lot of information regardless. And so to help the reviewer and reader just make sense and digest all of this cool stuff, a summary is really important. What did you tell them? Why is this important? And how are you extending this body of knowledge? That summary is really helpful. So I promised that there were 2 questions on that narrating front that we'd have a closer look on. So let's do that right now. Those 2 questions about narrating were: what should you include in your narration of the literature review, and how should you sort these elements, so content and form, right? Let's take these one by one. First of all, you'll remember back in the first slide of this webinar, there was this little backslash between theory and literature review. And the reason being, especially in the case of qualitative research, you'll find that theoretical pieces and scholarly literature, just empirical work, often overlaps. And so rarely will you find a separate section on theory and then literature in a qualitative research paper. You will often find the literature review including both theoretical pieces and empirical or data-based pieces. And usually they will be structured, again, in terms of categories or chronology or shifts in the field. Now, the next important thing about content is how much should you include? Do you include 1 article, 50 articles, 100 articles? What do you include? And moreover, how much should you source from news websites, public reports, anecdotal reports, things which are not necessarily considered scholarly journals? My personal suggestion is moderation is good. No one's really expecting or wanting a whole lot of research articles over here where you are just not really doing justice to any of the research articles. You're just providing a brief overview. That doesn't really do much to further the rhetorical argument of your literature review. And then on the second question about how much do you source from these non-scholarly sources, again, moderation is a great response. If they are relevant, include them, absolutely. For instance, you might come across really great data from a public report talking about the statistics and the widespread nature of a particular social phenomena that you're examining in your paper. Of course you want to include that. You want to cite that though as well. You don't want your literature review to be entirely dominated by these non-scholarly sources, so it still should be very much a scholarly paper. And then how deep should you go into specific articles or sources? My answer to that would be that it depends on the nature of your article. So this is where the exemplars, the best practice articles from your course readings, become really, really helpful. See how they have tended to treat the research articles. How deep do they really go into them? You don't want to only just adopt a flyby approach where you're just mentioning who did what and what they looked at, and that's it, without really going into any of the really important parts of the research or their contributions. Nor do you want to spend maybe 1 whole paragraph only looking at a single research article. So again, moderation is important. You also want to be careful that you provide detail, you provide insight, but then you're not also just, you don't go overboard with detail. So we talked about what you should include, the content, the level of detail so far. How do you sort these elements now? And that becomes a really important question. Uh, few quick suggestions. Subheadings are really helpful because, again, it makes the reviewer understand the logical flow of the argument. How is your literature review really going to flow? Teaser paragraphs are also really helpful after each subheader. Because this lists the major categories or otherwise explains the narration style that you are going to adopt in your different subsections of your literature review. So as soon as you start a new subsection right after the subheader, include this teaser paragraph that maybe just previews what your major themes are going to be of your research review, and how you're going to organize this. Signposts and lists are, again, also really helpful, especially if you are adopting maybe a chronological or a categorical way of organizing the literature. Signposts, for instance, using words like first, second, third, I'm going to look at these categories of research. Similarly, if you are using a competitive framing of shifts in the field, you can definitely use signposts like on the one hand and on the other hand, and these really become helpful. Lists can be great, but again, do not use bullet pointed lists. These are usually lists, again, in text form. Finally, summarize, summarize, summarize. You already have to do a summary at the end of the main section of the literature review. If you can squeeze in a really short summary at the end of each subsection as well to just highlight what you talked about in each subsection, that would be great too. It doesn't have to be long, can just be a few short lines. And this last part is important because in a qualitative research paper, the research question that you're going to be asking, right, why you're studying this, what specifically you're interested in, that usually comes at the end of the literature review. And this is a little different from a quantitative methods research paper, where the hypotheses and the research questions are often mixed throughout. So let's choose an example to see how this works out in practice, right? So imagine that this is the paper that you're writing. Ethical leadership practices for corporate social responsibility communication in small and medium enterprises, right? So right away now you realize that you need to get research on ethical leadership. You need research on corporate social responsibility, CSR, but then you also have another qualification because you should look specifically for either CSR practices or leadership practices in the context of SMEs, or small and medium enterprises. What could a literature review for this kind of paper look like? And so that's what you've got here on the left-hand side. This is, of course, assuming APA style, just to be clear. So you need to have a centered heading. What is the literature review? And directly after that heading, have a short introductory paragraph to just preview or overview some of the following subsections. So imagine, in your literature review, you realize that there were maybe some key leadership frameworks that you found, and you found especially two main theories or two main clusters of theory that really address ethical leadership. Well, then you'll want a subsection which overviews all of these theories. So ethical leadership frameworks is your first subsection under your literature review. And then directly after this subheading, you'll want an introductory paragraph again, explaining how there are these two theoretical schools that really address the impact of ethical leadership on CSR communication. And there are subsections after that, below that as well. So you see the difference in heading styles. And so you have ethical leadership theory 1 and ethical leadership theory 2. And for each of these subsections, you will want to have a series of paragraphs that really explains in detail what this theory 1 and theory 2 really are about. So at a minimum, you'll want to describe and explain what these theories are. You need to bring in examples from published literature about how they have been tested empirically using examples of data. And then you'll need to transition from one subsection to the other subsection. So before moving on from theory 1 to theory 2, you will want some sort of a short couple of lines to explain, now that you've studied theory 1, you're now moving on to study theory 2. You will repeat exactly what you did for theory 1 here under the theory 2 subsection as well, right? But then that's not all you've got, right? Your literature review also has to look at CSR specifically in small and medium enterprises. And so far, you also haven't necessarily spelled out the gap in knowledge or why your work is going to extend this body of research. And so this is where that all important other really transition paragraph really becomes important. This is just an example. And so you could, for instance, point out that there's a gap in knowledge because neither theory 1 nor theory 2 really adequately explains CSR communication in small and medium enterprises. Maybe, the literature that you've really looked at tends to focus primarily on large companies, and there isn't as much attention to detail on SMEs. In that case, point that out and explain why it's important that you look at SMEs, why it's important that we need this new perspective towards ethical leadership in CSR, in SMEs. And that paragraph, which addresses the gap in knowledge and addresses how you're going to look at this issue, really becomes an important transition paragraph to your next subsection, on CSR communication in SMEs. So again, the way to distinguish between subsections, ethical leadership frameworks, and CSR communication from the subsections is really their heading. That's why, again, you see why heading conventions are really so important. So under your CSR communication and SMEs subsection, you'll want to repeat what you just did earlier for the previous subsection. In short, you'll want to explain and describe the research that has been done in this area. You'll want to use empirical examples. And yeah, you'll also need to establish the need or the relevance to study this issue. Finally, that's it. That's the last part of your literature review. But you do need a couple more things, right? You need the summary. You need to summarize all of what you actually just spent 8 pages in doing. Usually to a small paragraph, you kind of establish that, you talked about theory 1, theory 2, you talk about why they were not enough on their own, and so you need a combination or a new way of thinking about CSR in SMEs, and you talk about how you're going to give them or provide your readers this new perspective. And that's your summary paragraph. And then right after that, the last part of your literature review, you end by stating your research question. Just simply and clearly, RQ1 is, for instance, how do ethical leaders ensure corporate social responsibility communication in small and medium enterprises? After you've stated your research question, guess what? You're done with your literature review, and it's time to focus on the methods. That's it for me right now. Thank you so much for spending time in viewing this webinar, and I hope you found it useful.